You mentioned that the checks and balances, the Senate, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but a certain degree of equality among residents and citizens goes back to the classical period. And just to play devil's advocate before we move on, since I saw that this was a criticism that you addressed in one of the books, how do you respond here to the criticism that Greek societies often employed slavery? They were rigidly hierarchical in other ways that we would deem inhumane in the West today, and so that maybe we shouldn't laud them in the way that you do.
Yeah, well, there's this term, whataboutism, you're hearing a lot, but
What aboutism?
yeah, whataboutism. So rather than answering the question, you say, what about them? And what I'm saying is I'm going to employ it, because if you can name one society, contemporary society, that did not have slavery, I'd like to know, because there was none. And the word slave, as we know, comes from Slav, and that refers to the rise of the Seljuk Turks and the Ottomans in the 13th century in Anatolia and all the way up to the 19th century, who probably enslaved over 25 million people. Most of them were from the Balkans, and most of them were from southern Russia and around the Black Sea. And then the Arab world imported into the Middle East probably somewhere around 15 to 20 million African slaves. And then you had Europeans importing about 11 to 12 million to the New World. And then you had slavery endemic in Africa as well. So I can't think of a society contemporaneous with the Greeks that wasn't slave, nor can I think of any society at the time that had a sophisticated critique of slavery. And that can be found in the plays of Euripides. The famous rhetorician, Alcidamas, has a famous quote, God made no man a slave. In fact, I use that for a number of articles. Then you had the liberator of Epaminondas in 370 BC, excuse me. He led a huge pan-Hellenic army down into Sparta, and he freed the Messenian Helots. They were serfs/slaves. And he was a great liberator, and he was considered by Cicero, for example, the greatest man that Greece produced for that act. There was a big contention about the morality of slavery, because you can see it in Aristotle's Politics and Ethics when he advances this idea that there's such a thing as a natural doulos, a natural slave. And what he's replying to is implicit criticism that slavery is somehow unjust. So he's trying to come up with an exegesis that says, well, some people are naturally servile, so they're better off as slaves. And that was very influential, because the antebellum South used that bogus argument to justify racial slavery. The other thing to remember about slavery, it was insidious in the ancient world. By insidious, I mean it was systemic, but it was not based on race. And so it was an equal opportunity enslaver. Plato at one time we were told, was temporarily a slave. It was mostly from people who were captured in war. And there was no intellectual or moral baggage invested other than what Aristotle was reacting against. One of the reasons he was reacting against it was he was upset, supposedly, that there were very brilliant mathematical teachers, geometry teachers that were slaves, Greek slaves. Romans conquered them in the 3rd century, 2nd century BC. It was very prestigious to get a Greek slave that was very learned, much more learned than his Roman master. But my point is, unlike later slavery, and from the 15th century on, that was race-based, there was no investment that the slave was naturally inferior to the master. And that made it much harder to eradicate, because anybody at any time, anywhere, could be a slave. And there was no protection against that. So what I'm getting at is, if you were in the 5th century and the slave said to the master, well, I'm a student of Pythagoras, and I understand Democritus' atomic theory, and I'm teaching your children, and you don't know any of that. So why am I a slave and you're not? And the answer would have been, because you're unlucky and I'm not. And it's your fortune to get captured. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sorry, that's the way it goes. That's much harder to eradicate because there's no investment in a pseudo principle of inferiority based on race. But when you have what racial slavery was both a late development in the Western world, but it was also the beginning of an easier way to eliminate it. So when the Europeans came to Africa in the 15th century, 16th century, and they came in sophisticated navigation, they had firearms, they equated their technology with superiority. And they said, these people are inferior. The Arabs did the same thing. The Ottomans did the same thing. And they enslaved people on the principle that they were inferior. But once they brought them to the New World, and there were people who had some, Frederick Douglass, or some people had access to education, and they proved not to be inferior, then that put the entire premise of slavery into question. And it was easy to eliminate, because you say, there's no moral reason that this person should be a slave or not, because you're not doing what the ancient Greeks said. The ancient Greeks said, we don't need it. It's just luck. It's some people are short, some people are small, some people get sick, some people get slaved. And that was the problem with getting rid of it. It was much harder to say it was wrong, but there were people who did say it was wrong.
Well, just to clarify, because I think this is exceedingly important in light of contemporary revisionist history, am I right in saying that what I'm hearing is that the Greeks were revolutionary in many senses and very forward-thinking politically with regard to equality, despite the slavery, and we should judge the shortcomings that we see now in the context of the time and even the centuries after, and not at all against our contemporary moralizing?
Yes. I think that's a general principle for looking at the past in general. You don't excuse the immorality of the past, but it's very difficult and problematic to be the beneficiary of 2,500 years of material progress and moral improvement and have models of 2,500 years by which to emulate. And then suddenly say, well, in the here and now, I judge you inferior in 420 because you don't meet my contemporary standards. That's one thing that's wrong about that. The second is, as I said, you don't have to be perfect to be good. You have to say to yourself, compared to what? So if there's slavery in the Aztec civilization, and that we know that when the Spanish conquistadors landed in Tenochtitlan in 1519, there were things that were familiar. Slavery was on the way out in 1519 in mainland Spain, but they did have African slaves, and they brought with them, they didn't object to the slavery, but they objected to cannibalism and they objected to human sacrifice. And so, in the Spanish way of saying, they would say, well, we have slaves, they have slaves. We have hierarchies, they have hierarchies. We can have intolerant religion, but we don't sacrifice people and we don't eat them. And so what I'm getting at is that people tend to focus on the West, and they don't use a comparable method of adjudication with other cultures for a variety of reasons. The other final, Philip, is this. We have no idea what people will say of us. So these very fierce critics of antiquity and say, they had slavery. Well, people are going to come back in 500 years and say, well, wait a minute. We've studied what 2023 was like in San Francisco. These very sophisticated, very liberal people allowed 7,000 people to inject, to fornicate, to urinate, and to kill themselves right on the streets of San Francisco, defecate. How can they do that? That was medieval. Or they may say, wow, they are aborting children that they should have known that the child gives of sophisticated technology might have been able to live outside the womb at 2.5 months, 3 months. They had that and yet they were terminating that child with a heartbeat. We don't know what they're going to say, but they're going to say something, and it will likely be critical. So it seems to me people should have a little bit of modesty and humble attitude to to think that they're not going to be exempt from the same type of scrutiny. It's inherent to the West. Remember that Western civilization is the only really sophisticated, self-critical society. That's innate in Thucydides, Aristophanes, Aristotle, Plato. They tear each other apart. And I don't know if that's true of the Chinese tradition or the African tradition or the Native American tradition to the same degree, at least in the abstract.